Hi everyone, my name is Jason Callow, and we're here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm going to be cooking Brussels sprouts with roasted chestnuts and caramelized shallots and mushrooms today. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to blanch these Brussels sprouts that I've already cut. So I've got a pot of boiling water here and a strainer that's built in, which is pretty handy. I like to generously salt the water, so a couple handfuls of salt. You can't really overdo it too much because you're not going to really be retaining that water for anything in the future. So the next step is to toss in the Brussels sprouts. And we're mainly doing this to ensure even cooking in the Brussels sprouts and to bring out the color of the Brussels sprouts. If you just try to cook them straight out, then you're going to have trouble. They're going to cook unevenly and they could turn brown on the outside. So once they're in there, you want to give them a nice stir. And you can already see that they're starting to turn bright green. And just want to make sure that as you stir them that all of them are getting cooked because they do tend to float to the top. This will take probably between 1 and 3 minutes depending on how you cut the Brussels sprouts and the size of your Brussels sprouts. So we're going to pull them out. Strain it off, and I have a bucket full of water here. It's ice water. And we're going to dump those in there. Turn the burner off and give this a nice stir. Make sure that it's nice and cool. You want to stop the cooking entirely, so the ice and the water is really going to help make sure that that happens. And once they're cool, you're going to go ahead and strain those off again. And we're going to set those aside for later on in the recipe. All right, the next step in the recipe is going to be to roast the chestnuts. And we'll do that at about 400 degrees for about 10 minutes. If your oven does have a convection, it helps to turn it on. If not, it's not going to make a huge difference. You're just going for a nice caramelization on the chestnuts. So I'm going to take the chestnuts, put them into a mixing bowl, and I'm going to add about a tablespoon of olive oil and a small pinch of salt so that it cooks into the chestnuts, a little bit of pepper, and then give them a nice toss. Make sure that they're really well coated. And then we're going to go right onto the pan. Make sure they're spread out nice and evenly. And then into the oven. All right, the chestnuts have finished roasting. And this is what they look like as a finished product. And important note is that I chose to use pre-cooked vacuum-sealed chestnuts. They're from France. I have done the chestnuts fresh in the past. Can be quite time-consuming and can be quite a headache. So if you're not ready to commit to a few hours of burning your fingers and peeling those shells off, it's a great substitute, and they come out fine. Nobody will ever know the difference. If you want, you can even tell them you peeled them yourself. So the next stage and what we're going to do is we're going to add just a tiny bit of olive oil to the bottom of this pan. Just enough to give a little coating, about a tablespoon. And then we're going to go in with the bacon. And we're going to let that cook for between 4 and 6 minutes until it starts to brown on the edge, gets nice and crispy, and then we're going to strain it off in a couple minutes. You want to do this on medium-high heat, not too high, because if you put the heat up too high, then it'll cook unevenly. So you want it to be high enough to brown it, but not high enough to burn the edges before the center cooks all the way through. All right, so the bacon is done cooking, and this is about what it should look like right now. Now I've strained the bacon off, and I've set it on a paper towel to absorb any of the extra fat and grease that might be hanging out on there. And I've strained off the bacon grease, and I've reserved about 3 tablespoons in the bottom of the pan, which I'm going to heat over medium-high heat, a little bit lower than when we cook the bacon. We want to let that get nice and hot, and then we're going to toss the mushrooms in. And we're going to do the mushrooms first, just for a minute or two. That lets them start to get cooking before we toss in the shallots. And the shallots are a little thinner of a slice, and we don't want them to burn while we're waiting on the mushrooms to caramelize. All right. You can hear them start to sizzle now. They're starting to get their first layer of brown on the bottom. So we're going to go ahead and toss in, it's about a ½ pound of shallots. And that was a pound of mushrooms that we tossed in there. And we're going to stir those up real nice. And once you start letting the caramelization process happen, you want to let it go, and you don't want to stir the pan a lot. You want to let those sugars settle to the bottom of the pan. You want to let them really cook out so that you get a nice layer of brown on each part. And then you're going to give it a stir or a toss if you prefer. And then you're going to do the same thing again. And this is why it takes, the time can really vary anywhere between 6 and 15 minutes depending on how high you set your settings. And the lower, like I said, is going to allow the entire onion and the entire mushroom to caramelize rather than just the outside. All right, it's been about 10 to 12 minutes, and as we can see, this is starting to really brown up nicely. So we are ready to move on. Next step is we're going to take the chestnuts that we roasted earlier, and we're going to toss those in. And then we are going to add 3 tablespoons of garlic. And we're going to toss this around, turn the heat up a little bit, back up to medium-high from medium-low. We're going to toss that around a little bit. Spread it out evenly, and we're going to let the garlic brown a little. And then this is also going to allow the chestnuts to soften. When you roast them, you're getting a nice caramelized outside, but that also tends to make them a little crispy. So you want to soften them back up so that as people eat them, they're not dry and hard. So once this is brown, after about a minute or two, we're going to deglaze with about 1/3 cup of white wine, and that is going to pull up all of the bits that are stuck on the inside of the pan, and we're going to scrape all of those off. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to toss in the bacon. We'll give that a toss. We can smell the garlic cooking. We know that it's starting to get nice and crispy. We're going to hit this with 1/3 cup of wine. Give it a good scrape. Make sure, don't lose anything. And then in with the Brussels sprouts. You can see how blanching them really brought that green color out. They look real nice. And they're nice and evenly cooked. So now that we have everything in one big pan, we're going to give it a nice toss. And we're going to let that alcohol from the wine cook off a little bit, and then just the flavor will remain. And then we're going to give it a nice seasoning. All right, so final touch is about 1 to 2 tablespoons of thyme. Whatever your personal preference is. If you really like the flavor of thyme like me, you could go heavy on 2 tablespoons. Or if you like it a little lighter, you could just add 1 and it'll be fine. We're going to give that a toss in there. We're going to season salt and pepper to taste. I never give amounts on salt and pepper. It's a add, taste, add, taste. If you give an amount, the flake size of the salt could be different than mine, and you could add too much, ruin the dish, not enough, and you'll blame me. I don't want to blame. Remember that there is bacon in there. That's going to add a little bit of salty flavor to it, so you don't want to go too heavy. Just a small pinch is probably fine. A little bit of cracked fresh pepper, maybe a little more. Give it another toss. Now you see why I was using the wok at the beginning of the recipe. And looks like we almost have a finished product. All right, and so when I turned the oven off, after I roasted the chestnuts, I took my great-grandmother's favorite bowl, put it in the oven so it's nice and warm to hold the Brussels sprouts. And we're going to give them a pour into here. Make sure that you scrape all the good stuff off there. And this is Brussels sprouts with roasted chestnuts, caramelized mushrooms, and shallots.